year of piano lessons. You might not really remember how to do much with piano, right? But if you were practicing piano every day for 10 years, the brain recognizes that as something it needs to hang on to. And so really what ends up happening is that around adolescence, the brain starts figuring out that it needs more room to learn more things, and it starts pruning out the stuff that it hasn't used. Where this applies for our conversation about child trauma is that the brain doesn't see any of this as good or bad. The brain is really there primarily to survive, and it will do anything it needs to help the brain and body survive. And so by that logic, something the brain is experiencing all the time is going to be something that's a little more ingrained, something that doesn't get pruned out, something that isn't getting experienced as frequently or has never been experienced, may not have that connection, or that connection might get pruned out. And so what this means is for kids who experience a lot of adversity early in childhood, including abuse, their brain may get very used to managing that situation. Those connections, those experiences, and those ways of responding get really ingrained, whereas some of the other skills that we would hope for them to learn may not have been learned or may have gotten pruned out. And so I want you to imagine for a moment that a baby is born into what we'll call a safe world. And when I say that, I mean relative safety. Okay, nobody's world is 100% safe 100% of the time. But in general, what we'd think of when we thought of a safe world would be people in that child's life that were relatively predictable, relatively stable, right? That might mean that their mental health was relatively stable, they weren't using substances, their basic needs were met, and they were able to meet the child's basic needs like food, clothing, and shelter. The parent or the caregiver in that child's life would have the capacity to really build a relationship, to build some attachment. And generally, kids who grow up in that kind of environment see the world as predictable, pretty stable, pretty fun. Those kids are in pretty good shape when it comes time to go to school, because along the way, they learn some of the social rules that we expect, right? They learn to wait their turn. They learn to sit quietly. They learn, how to, engage in social settings. Okay. Now let's imagine a baby that was born into what we'll call a dangerous world. And so when you think about how that child's life may have looked different, basic needs might not be met regularly or consistently. If that parent is struggling with mental health, physical health, violence in the home, criminal problems, other stressors, they may not be as available to build a relationship with that child. And we know that for parents who struggle with substance use, they tend not to get as much pleasure out of spending time with their children. They may get sidetracked by drug seeking or other behaviors that we know contribute to ongoing substance use. And this child might not be physically or emotionally safe in the way that we might hope. The world might be very unpredictable, especially if they have food scarcity or housing difficulties or multiple caregivers or violence in the home. Things may not feel stable. Things may feel very, very fragile. And there might be a lot of stress, not as much fun. So what happens for these kids is that when it's time for them to go to school, their brain and body has spent a lot of time making those connections between danger and the world. And so just like I was saying a minute ago, that the brain doesn't see things as good or bad, it just sees them as it is, and this is what I need to do to survive. That happens for kids who experience, unstable, unpredictable, and adverse childhood, homes, environments, and experiences. And so those kids get to school and they may not have learned some of the social skills we would have expected, right? We teach kids, use your words, not your hands. Well, if you grow up in a home where there's violence, that might not be the lesson that you've learned or that your brain has learned. We tell kids to sit quietly in their chairs. That's fine if your brain is not constantly in that fight, flight, or freeze, or that place where, the brain is searching for danger. And again, if the brain has been searching for danger a lot, that's going to be the brain's go-to. Those are going to be the connections that are the most ingrained. This might be a kid who, you ask them to sit with their back to the door and their fight or flight gets really amped up. Their ability to stay calm is really difficult. All we mean when we say fight, flight, or freeze is the body's response to stress and the brain's response to stress. And essentially what the brain does is if there's a dangerous situation, it figures out quickly or it assesses quickly whether or not we should fight, we should run, or we should freeze and hope to survive it. Okay. And so, like I said, none of this is good or bad, right? This is what the brain does to survive. Where this becomes the problem is when kids or adults go through their early lives living in that constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. Our brains are really only, and bodies are really only designed to be in that heightened form of stress for about 20 minutes at a time, long enough to run or hide and basically get away from the danger, right, or survive the danger. But if your brain is constantly in fight, flight, or freeze because of the dangers around you, then you get to school or a job and you're expected to sit still, to concentrate, to use your words, to learn, to keep your emotions in check. And the brain just hasn't been set up for that. Very much in the same way that if you've always lived in the coldest place in the world, your brain and body are not really prepared for a warm, sunny beach, right? Now, eventually in time, if you lived at that beach long enough, the brain would adapt. But initially, the brain's going to be like, what? And that's really what happens for these kids and for these adults who end up in situations that, that society sees as very good and sees as very adaptable, but are very different than what that person has experienced. Our society is set up well for people with the ability to keep their emotions in check and think logically and clearly. In other words, they're able to regulate their emotions and they're able to manage their fear. But this is not true for people who've experienced a lot of trauma. The thinking part of the brain, so the brain that's responsible for judgment and decision making, that tends to be underactivated, while the fear center, that fight, flight, or freeze, and the emotion center tends to be, activated much differently. The fear center is overactivated, and the ability to regulate those emotions is underactivated. So you've got a thinking part of the brain that can't work as well as we'd like it to solve problems. We've got an emotional part of the brain that's really overactive. And we've got a part of the brain that we'd like to keep the emotions in check that can't do it. Okay. Just thinking about this a little bit differently, because sometimes I'll have people ask, well, isn't stress part of life? Do I have to fear that if my kid has ever had a stressor, then this is what we're looking at? And that's not true. And so there's 3 different types of stress that we really look at. One of them is called positive stress, and that's going to be more temporary, mild stuff. That's going to be, getting a vaccine. That's going to be your first day of daycare. There's going to be some brief increases in your heart rate. You're going to feel mildly stressed. It's going to be, over quickly. Tolerable stress is a little bit more serious. It might be a trauma, but it's relatively short term. And the really important part is that it's typically buffered by supportive relationships and some stability elsewhere. So if you get in a car accident as a child, but everything else in your life is relatively stable, that becomes a much more tolerable level of stress. Toxic stress is what we're referring to here. This is more consistent stress. Maybe it happens over several years or several developmental periods. And that is where the brain is in that fight, flight, or freeze much more frequently than it should be. And without that support in a lot of cases. Does anyone have any questions so far? All right, not seeing any. I'm going to keep plugging along. So where this brings us to the ACEs study is that back in the early 90s, the CDC and a private practitioner physician, decided to really look at how these experiences influence different health outcomes. And so the ACEs study is an epidemiological study. And all that means is that it was a study that looked at the origins of disease, disability, productivity, and health in a population. So it looked at one particular issue and considered kind of on a more global scale how it might be impacting our public health. And so the two investigators were Dr. Anda, he worked for the CDC, and Dr. Folletti, who was in private practice at the time. And this study was unique for a lot of different reasons. First and foremost, early in the 90s, a lot of studies were looking at childhood adversity in small SNPs. So they were looking at child sexual abuse, they were looking at child physical abuse, they were looking at domestic violence. This study decided to look at multiple forms of childhood adversity. It also was a pretty big study for its time, and even still. It looked at results from over 17,000 adults, and all of these adults had Kaiser Permanente insurance, which meant that they all had private insurance, which meant that most of them were employed, they were generally well educated, they had a higher socioeconomic status than a lot of the people that have been looked at in trauma studies previously. They were also primarily white. And so again, that does not mean that this study was not without its limitations, but one of the important things to remember here is that it was one of the first studies that really looked and said trauma doesn't discriminate. It said, hey, trauma doesn't just happen in urban settings with minority folks who, have no education and low socioeconomic status. No, quite the opposite. It really said trauma doesn't discriminate, which was an important finding at the time. In this study, we're going to talk about the findings from the original study, but this study has been replicated and expanded in some really, really incredible ways in the years since it was first conducted. So the ACE study originally looked at 10 adverse childhood experiences in 3 categories. So it looked at physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse in the abuse category. It looked at physical neglect and emotional neglect in the neglect category. And then it looked at a category called household dysfunction. And it looked at an adult in the home who had mental health struggles, a parent or relative who was incarcerated, a parent or caregiver who was struggling with substance use, parental separation or divorce. And then it also looked at a mother being treated violently. Future studies have certainly expanded it to look at the impact of men being victims of domestic violence, but in that original study, it was specifically mothers. And the study found that ACEs were highly interrelated. So I don't know why my slides keep jumping ahead. The study found that ACEs were highly interrelated, meaning when there was one, there was often more than one. So when there was one ACE in the life of a child, 87% of the time, at least one of those other 9 ACEs had also occurred. And you can kind of see how that would make sense, right? If you've got a parent who's struggling with mental health, for example, they may also be struggling to meet their child's needs physically or emotionally. They may be emotionally or physically abusive to that child. If there's domestic violence in their home, there might also be physical abuse. There might also be sexual abuse. There might also be substance use or incarceration. So when you think about this, and the families that we serve, you can certainly see how these would connect. Because of this, the researchers decided that it didn't really make sense to try to tease apart the impacts of certain types of trauma on outcomes. So instead, they created an ACE score. An ACE score is the number of yeses that were given to those 10 questions. So people were asked, did this happen to you? And you said yes or no. It didn't matter how many times it happened to you. It didn't matter how severe the experience was. If you said no, you got a 0. And if you said yes, you got a 1. And then all of the ones were added up. So somebody who said no to all of those ACEs, who denied experiencing any of those ACEs, had an ACE score of 0. Somebody who might have acknowledged all of those ACEs had an ACE score of 10, and then everything. In that original study, 1/3 of the population, so 33%, had an ACE score of 0. Then the 2/3 of the population had an ACE score of at least 1. 16% of the sample, so roughly 1 in 6, had an ACE score of 4 or more. And so think of this ACE score as a measure of the level of stress that the brain was under, right? So as the ACE score goes up, the exposure to those effects of that toxic stress, of that constant fight, flight, or freeze went up as well. Now, you may hear, about ACE scores. They've become much more prevalent and much more front and center in some of the public health and media campaigns. And so I think it's really important to say what an ACE score is and what it's not. The other reason that I think that's important is that as you're looking at those 10 ACEs, you might be figuring out what your own ACE score is. And so I want to be really clear that an ACE score is not a diagnostic tool. It cannot diagnose any disorders. It cannot screen in or out anything. And it cannot predict at the individual level what may or may not happen in the rest of your life. Okay. Any of the results that we talk about are on a public health, much grander scale level, not if this happens, if Amie scores this, Amie is doomed to have these results. It's also not a fun quiz, and so that might seem really obvious, but I can't tell you how many times I've had people be like, oh, I'm gonna share this with people and have them take it in my family or in my class or on my team. And I'd really be careful with that. The research shows that if you're not prepared to provide somebody with pretty good resources, you really don't want to be explicitly asking them to complete this score. Now, that's not to say that, again, people aren't going to see these traumas and start figuring out what their ACE score may be. But if you are going to hand somebody an ACE screener and ask them to do it, you have to be prepared with good referrals and warm handoffs and linkages to care. Okay. Why the ACE score is something that's stuck around and why it's important is because it is a history tool. It is a way to talk about these early life experiences in a non-judgmental way, right? To just say, here's your ACE score. An ACE score doesn't say which of those ACEs you've experienced. It doesn't say to what level of severity, and nobody walks around with a sticky note on their shirt that says what their ACE score is. But if 2 out of 3 people experience ACEs, then more often than not, you're running into people that have an ACE score of at least 1, right? And so this also can really be a gateway to empathy and compassion. And I always say compassion is empathy in action. So it's not enough just to say, hey, I know how that must feel, but to actually say, I know what that must feel like, and I'm going to make decisions based on how I know you must be feeling. That's the difference. And again, it's increasingly becoming part of the common language. My number story, which is a campaign through out of California, they're doing a lot of work to really promote this idea that it's just you are not your number, but really putting out there what ACEs are and what the ACE score is. And so it is an important piece of kind of where we're at from a public health perspective, but it is not it's not the only piece of information you're going to want to read. What the study found was that the higher the person's ACE score, the higher their risk of impairment, the higher their risk of engaging in high-risk behaviors, the higher their risk of disease, disability, and social problems, and the higher risk of early death. Okay, and so again, you can kind of think about how this might make sense. So if your brain is constantly in fight, flight, or freeze, and you find that using substances or drinking helps with that, right? It may help with those symptoms, and that's why I think the brain science is important. It may help manage some of those symptoms, but it's going to cause other problems potentially, right? Criminal problems, occupational problems, relationship problems. Okay, that's the disease, disability, and social problems piece. When I do this ACE Master interface training, which is a different slide set, when I do that in Maryland, I show a ton of different slides about, the rates of some of these health outcomes with your ACE score. And what we know is that there's a dose-response relationship. And so a dose-response relationship means the more of one you have, the more of the other. So the more gas you put in your tank, the more miles you can drive. And right now, the more money you spend, right? The higher your ACE score, the higher your risk of health problems. And again, if you think about the mechanisms that are going on, this makes sense. So one of the outcomes is lung disease. What contributes to lung disease? Smoking, right? Why do people smoke? People smoke to calm themselves, to manage stress. So let's imagine that you're someone who has a high ACE score. Your brain is constantly in fight, flight, or freeze. You feel constantly on edge and kind of ready to run or fight or check out. And you find that smoking really helps calm that. Well, you're more likely to keep smoking, right? As opposed to someone who tries it once and says they don't like it. And if you keep smoking, you're more likely to develop a smoking-related health problem like COPD or lung disease. And if you have COPD, you have a higher risk of dying sooner. So that's how they all connect. Does anyone have any questions about that? For those of you who have access to your reaction button, can you just go ahead and give me a reaction, like if this is making sense? Give me a thumbs up, or just so that I know everybody's with me. All right, great. Thank you for those of you who did that. Great. All right. So there were no shortage of health issues that were linked to ACEs. There are so many mental health, physical health, social health issues that have been linked to ACEs. And so this is just, I really like this graph because I feel like it just gives a really nice kind of overview, but this is not exhaustive. So Hughes, Bellis, Hardcastle, and their team published an article that looked at the relationship between having no ACEs and these health issues and having 4 or more ACEs, these health issues. And as you can see, there were some significant links. And so just to kind of orient you to this slide, the bigger the circle, the bigger the connection between 4 more ACEs. And so those people that had 4 more ACEs were 30 times more likely to attempt suicide than someone with no ACEs. They were 10 times more likely to struggle with problem drug use. They were 3.7% or 3.7 times more likely to initiate sex earlier. They were 3.7 times more likely to struggle with anxiety, 7.5 times more likely to experience another type of victimization. So these are pretty important. Understanding someone's ACEs are really, really important because they give us some important information about what risk they may be facing. Now, again, just because you have an high ACE score does not mean that you are doomed to experience any of these things. There are no shortage of people who have 0 as their ACE score who struggle with these things, and people with ACE scores of 10 who do not struggle with these things. But we do know that the higher your ACE is, the higher your risk. Okay, and so just like if everyone in your family has had cancer, it's not a guarantee that you're going to have cancer, but that risk keeps increasing, right? Same thing with ACEs. The other thing that started happening after this ACE study started getting traction was that people were like, that seems overly simplistic. There's a lot going on, right? And so Dr. Ellis and Dr. Dietz, they are part of the Building Community Resilience Project, and they developed what's called the pair of ACEs image. And this image has become pretty well known because it just illustrates beautifully how the social determinants of health kind of play in. And so this pair of ACEs tree image grew out of the need to illustrate that adversity doesn't happen within a family in a vacuum, right? Adversity within a family is happening simultaneously or interconnected to adversity within a community. And so the leaves on the tree are the symptoms of ACEs that are pretty easily recognizable when you're in clinical settings, or if a child goes to preschool, right? Those are things that, we can ask about and we can understand. Adverse childhood experiences increase a person's risk for chronic stress and adverse coping mechanisms that can result in lifelong difficulties, right? The tree here is planted in poor soil that's seeped in lots of different systemic issues. And so, to carry the metaphor, the nutrients that are necessary to support that tree, to support a thriving community, are not there. And so when there are adverse community environments, where housing is unstable and there's community violence and there's discrimination and people don't have access to social and economic supports, there's this cycle, right? Where because of those things, we have other adverse childhood experiences that happen. Those children go on to kind of stay in the community and don't add nutrients to the soil in the way that they need, right? And it becomes this vicious cycle. And then before you know it, the leaves on the tree are withering or being impacted. And so there's lots of different ways that this has been demonstrated. Again, you can look at the social ecology model, where you look at the individual, the relationship, the community, and society, and you can see how they all intersect. This is just another way of looking at that. The Philadelphia ACE project was another way that this idea has been examined. And so Roy Wade and his group in Philadelphia designed an expanded ACEs study that looked specifically at including community trauma. So it looked at those initial 10 ACEs that I told you about, and then it also added in community-based ACEs, like witnessing violence, feeling discriminated against, adverse neighborhood experiences, being bullied, or living in foster care. And these also were associated with health risk behavior, substance use, and depression. And so all of this is so important when we start thinking about the communities and the families that we serve. And so, there's a 2-generation approach, and really in some cases even more than 2 generations. But it's a place to start, right? Where we can look at parental health conditions that might be negatively impacting their ability to parent. And so if you think about it, if somebody experiences ACEs, they are more likely to grow up and experience, health outcomes that might put their children in a position where they're experiencing ACEs. So if your ACE score is connected to your risk of substance use, and you begin using substances and have children, your children, just by the nature of having a parent who's using substances, have an ACE score of 1. And that's how the cycle continues. And so, understanding kind of that intergenerational cycle and movement of ACEs through families and generations is really important. It can be important just to let parents know how critical their own mental health and social health and physical health is on their child and the child's outcomes. It can be really important and really helpful for parents to understand the value of learning some good parenting skills. Parents who are empathic, parents who are responsive, parents who are engaged, parents who find disciplinary practices that aren't harsh or dysfunctional. Those are parents who are less likely to abuse their children, right? By not abusing their children, that's one less ACE for their children. And by having those skills in place, you also put some important protective factors in place, which we're going to talk a little bit about. Just putting this in the context of parental substance use. And this is a graph that Mona has seen that I've used a couple times in some learning community calls we have. There are really clear pathways that heighten risk for child maltreatment depending on what's going on for the parent. And so in this case, it's conceptualizing the framework of substance use and child maltreatment. And so what we know is that accumulation of psychosocial stressors makes someone more likely to use substances. Somebody who is not able to regulate their emotions, more likely to use substances. Someone who, can't regulate emotions and can't keep a job, they might accumulate those stressors as well: housing, employment, social relationships. Okay. These parents, if they're struggling with stressors and emotions and substance use, they may not learn appropriate parenting skills. They may not have ever learned them themselves, right? If their ACEs involved parental abuse or neglect or modeling violence, they might not know how to parent. People who are struggling with substances spend a lot of time seeking out drugs. We have real preoccupation with that, regardless of what else is going on. And parents who are using substances don't tend to get, just on a biological level, don't tend to get as much pleasure from the parenting role as parents who are not using substances do. So those substances give such feedback through the brain that not a lot of other things really match up. And so, parenting is hard. And I think most of us who are parents would say that what keeps you going in the tough times is that there's good times, right? There's really good times. But if you don't get any pleasure out of those good times, it can be really hard. And this is where kids are at risk for child maltreatment. I've worked in child trauma for a long time. I've certainly worked with a couple of people who really were not well, and really were, at their core, very interested in hurting the children in their lives. But the majority of parents that I have worked with who have been physically abusive or emotionally abusive to their children are really parents who don't have the skills that they need. And that's not giving parents a pass, right? Just because we understand that we need to get parents to this place. And a lot of times it's deficits in parenting knowledge and skills, deficits in being able to manage their own emotions, psychosocial stressors, and then, not getting what they would want to or need to out of some of those interactions. Does anyone have any questions? Right. So this is where, people always want to know what they can do. So this is all like a little bit tough, right? It's a little bit tough to hear, be a little bit depressing. And so people want to know what they can do. And there are 3 protective factors that have been identified, and certainly we could go into more depth into some of the strategies and some of the things that the CDC recommends from a public health perspective. But in general, there are 3 areas. And the first one is really increasing our adults' abilities to cope and to problem solve. And so, the way that we set people up for success in our programs really makes a difference. So executive functioning skills, the ability to plan, to focus, to persist even when something isn't going well, to manage emotions, to be aware of emotions, to be flexible. Those are all things that I think we take for granted sometimes that people know how to do, but they really are skills. And again, if you grew up in an environment where there's a lot of toxic stress and a lot of dysfunction, you probably weren't having those skills modeled for you. And even if you were, your brain may not have been in a place to take it in and learn it. We are not good learners under stress. And the main reason is because our brain prioritizes survival over anything else. And so learning new skills kind of hits, takes a back burner if we're trying to run from a bear, right? To make it just really simple. And so people's brains are constantly in that running from a bear place. They may not be able to learn these skills. And so anything we can do to teach families these skills is really, really beneficial in minimizing ACEs and minimizing the impact of ACEs on future outcomes. The next thing is attachment with caring and competent adults. So I want you to think for just a moment about somebody who's important in your life and why they're important in your life. And my guess is that there are people that care about you and people that are there for you, but I'm guessing that there are also people that are relatively competent. And what I mean when I say that is that competency requires that you are able to learn and model skills and practice emotional and physical safety. This is particularly important when the person is hardwired for a dangerous or unpredictable world, right? When their brain is really in that constant fight, flight, or freeze, they might have a hard time regulating their emotions. They might have a hard time picking up on social cues. They might not have a lot of people in their life. Okay? And so individuals that have experienced ACEs, either, if they're still children or now if they're adults, those relationships are an opportunity for security to calm that brain so that we can learn and improve our skills and improve those individual competencies so that we can be better equipped to handle stressful situations. Connectedness is the key. So Bruce Perry, who's written a lot and spoken a lot on this topic, basically says that it's our superpower as humans. It's how we learn, it's how we teach, it's how we coach, it's how we parent, it's how we heal, it's how we learn. So anything we can do to connect with another being and do so in a kind, competent, calm way can be a difference maker for somebody whose brain is constantly in fight, flight, or freeze. The other thing we know is that we benefit from people. I was talking about this yesterday in our learning community call that Mona was a part of. Biologically, being around others when we were hunter-gatherers kept us safe. And so our brain gets pretty activated when we're alone or when lonely, and it prompts us to seek out other people. There's a great book, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is the Surgeon General. He published a book called Together. It really talks about loneliness as an epidemic in and of itself. But we know that social support is a big, big factor in helping people learn appropriate skills, feel safe and calm, and be able to be productive members of society. And so, you might be sitting there, hopefully not, but you might be sitting there thinking, what is in this? What's in it for me, right? Why does this matter for me? What am I going to do differently as a result? And we know that our brains don't really like change. And so we have to do some work to start thinking about ACEs and the people impacted by ACEs in a different way. So we want to shift away from words like resistant, manipulative, blaming, shaming words like they just don't want to try hard enough. They just don't care. They're just resistant. They're just lazy. They just, they want it to be this way, right? All of those things really negate the idea that the person's brain is responding and is wired to overreact or to react in a way that is not what we want from them societally. They are doing the very best that they can, and their brain might be bogged down with fight, flight, or freeze. It might be bogged down with, lack of skills. It might be bogged down with mental health challenges. And so rather than seeing individuals as resistant or lazy or not caring or a waste of resources, we may need to see them instead as someone who could really use some help strengthening some executive functioning skills, who really could benefit from some coping, who really could benefit from you modeling emotion regulation. And I think one of the reasons that I'm so excited that Access is working with our project from the public safety standpoint is, these are high pressure situations that the police officers and first responders go into, right? And their brain may be wired to respond in a high stress way because it is stressful. And they may be responding to a person who's in fight, flight, or freeze. That person who, you've had to apply Narcan multiple times, it can be really easy to start thinking that they just don't care. It can make us feel a little bit more hopeful to think that they just haven't learned the skills yet, or their brain hasn't just gotten rewired yet, such that they can respond in a way that keeps them safe and well. So all of this is really a start of thinking differently about the way we interact with the people that we see, and also just the people that we see in general. I like to say that when someone has a big reaction to something that doesn't seem like a big deal to us, they may be responding to something then and there. Their brain may just be jumping into action based on past experience versus the details of what's happening right now. So I left a few minutes here just so that we had some time in case people had questions. What questions do people have? What comments? What comes to mind?
Amy, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This was really good. If anyone has any comments or questions or need more information, you can, contact Amy or talk to email me. And, this is the first time we've done this type of training. Hopefully we'll do it again. But thank you again, Amy, for taking the time. Next month, we are going to be working a whole week of prevention. So usually we have a town hall in person, but in the last couple of years, we've done a 1 week prevention with different speakers. So stay tuned for more information on that. You will get an email or check us out on our social media. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you again,
everyone. Have a great day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
HES Academies have been serving the Detroit metro area for over 23 years, promoting academic excellence, leadership, and cultural diversity, ranking as some of the top schools in the state of Michigan. Our pre-K through 12th grade students enjoy tuition-free, state-accredited education by STEM certified and highly qualified staff with no geographical restrictions, and with advanced placement, college dual enrollment, scholarship, and Arabic language programs. Nor International Academy in Sterling Heights at niapsa.org, Star International Academy in Dearborn Heights and in Canton at starpsa.org, Universal Academy in Detroit at universalpsa.org, and Universal Learning Academy in Westland at ulapsa.org. Join HES Academies today and enjoy a free Chromebook for every enrolled student.